It was late October when Claire and her brother, Thomas, found themselves on the outskirts of Hollow Grove, a small, decaying town nestled between withered forests and abandoned fields. The drive had taken longer than expected, and now the sky was suffused with an oppressive dusk, the sort of twilight that feels thick and heavy, as though the world is holding its breath. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, as though the land itself was slowly rotting away beneath their feet. Thomas, a tall man in his late 20s with a perpetual air of impatience, tapped the steering wheel, clearly uncomfortable. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered, his voice strained with a hint of unease. Claire, on the other hand, was intrigued. She had always been drawn to the abandoned, the forgotten corners of the world. The dark, the unsettling, the mysterious. Hollow Grove had been mentioned in a history book she found in a library years ago, the last remnants of a once thriving village that had all but disappeared 100 years ago. It was only mentioned in passing, as a place that seemed to hold some kind of inexplicable curse. Yet, here they were, after all these years. "Maybe it's just the stories that make it seem spooky," Claire said, trying to reassure her brother. "We're just passing through." Thomas shot her a skeptical look but didn't say anything further. The car slowed as they reached the decaying sign marking the entrance to Hollow Grove. The letters, half erased by time and weather, read simply, Hollow Grove. Nothing else. No welcoming lights, no sign of life. Just a fading reminder of a place long forgotten. They turned onto the main road, which was barely more than a cracked, weed-choked path, the asphalt eaten away by time and neglect. The trees that lined the road were skeletal, their branches twisting like twisted fingers, reaching toward the sky. The buildings on either side of the road were in various states of ruin. Some had collapsed entirely, while others sagged in a way that made Claire feel as though they might crumble to dust at any moment. As they approached the heart of the town, they saw the first sign of life: an old woman standing by the side of the road. She was hunched, her back curved in a way that seemed unnatural, and her pale eyes were fixed on their car with an intensity that made Claire's skin crawl. "She looks odd," Thomas remarked, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. Claire, though, was more fascinated than frightened. She leaned forward, watching the woman as they passed. The woman's lips moved, but the words were too faint to hear. And yet, despite the distance, Claire could swear she heard the sound of her voice, a faint whisper that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice trembling slightly. Thomas just shook his head. "I didn't hear anything. Let's just get to the inn. I don't like this place." They finally arrived at the Hollow Grove Inn, a crumbling structure that seemed to sag under the weight of its own age. The windows were dark, and the wooden sign creaked as it swayed in the wind. It looked as though it hadn't seen a guest in years. The innkeeper, a gaunt man with hollow eyes and a voice like gravel, greeted them with an unsettlingly wide smile. His skin was pale, nearly translucent, as though he had spent too much time indoors. His hands shook as he handed them their key, which was attached to an old brass tag that read, "Room 7. "Welcome," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I hope your stay is comfortable." There was something strange about his gaze, something predatory beneath the surface. Claire caught herself staring at the way his pupils dilated slightly, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes. Thomas, however, seemed eager to leave. He grabbed the key quickly and led Claire inside. The interior of the inn was even worse than the exterior. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of mildew and dust, and the walls were adorned with faded portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow them as they moved. The furniture was old and uncomfortable, the floorboards creaking underfoot as though the building was trying to speak to them. Room 7 was at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. As they stepped inside, Claire immediately felt a chill. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight against the evening light, but it wasn't the absence of light that made it oppressive. It was the feeling that something was watching them. The bed was unmade, the sheets wrinkled and stained, and the wallpaper peeled in long, jagged strips. But it was the air that unsettled Claire the most, thick with an unspoken tension. "Let's just get some rest," Thomas said, dropping their bags onto the floor. He ran a hand through his hair and sighed. "This place is really starting to get to me." Claire didn't respond at first. She was staring at the large mirror on the far wall. The reflection was warped, the glass cloudy with age, but it wasn't that which caught her attention. It was the way the reflection seemed to shimmer and shift, as though something in the glass was moving just out of sight. She blinked and looked away, but when she glanced back, the mirror seemed perfectly still. Just the lighting, she told herself. The dust. Nothing more. But as the night wore on, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. In the stillness of the room, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, seemed magnified, distorted by her growing unease. The shadows seemed to press in on them, growing longer, more tangible with each passing moment. The night was uneventful at first. Claire and Thomas settled into the old, uncomfortable bed, trying to ignore the oppressive atmosphere of the room. Claire had nearly drifted off to sleep when she heard it, soft at first, like the faintest murmur. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind or the house settling, but the sound persisted, growing louder. It was a whisper, indistinct at first, but now clear enough to make her skin crawl. Help. The voice was faint, a woman's voice, but it was laced with something almost pleading. Something desperate. Claire? Thomas's voice was groggy with sleep, but it held a note of concern. What is it? Claire sat up slowly, heart pounding in her chest. The whispers were coming from somewhere in the room. She glanced around wildly, but there was nothing, no one. I heard something, she whispered back, her voice trembling. Thomas sat up, rubbing his eyes. Are you sure? You're probably just hearing things. But Claire could feel it now, the air growing colder, heavier. The whispers seemed to come from every corner of the room, swirling around her, growing louder. Help me. The voice was no longer a whisper, but a scream, a tortured, desperate cry for help. It sounded like it was right next to her, as though the woman was lying beside her in the bed. Claire could feel her breath growing shallow, her pulse quickening. Suddenly, Thomas jolted awake with a gasp. His eyes widened as he stared at something in the corner of the room. The air was thick with something else. What the hell is that? He said, his voice cracking with fear. Claire turned to follow his gaze, her blood running cold. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. It was a woman, or at least, something that looked like a woman. She was pale, almost translucent, her body twisted unnaturally as though it were bent out of shape. Her long, black hair hung in tangled strands, her face obscured by the shadow of her hair. And then, as if sensing their gaze, she slowly turned her head toward them. Her eyes were dark voids, nothing but endless black pits where her pupils should have been. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, just a gaping maw, empty and endless. And then, with a sudden, horrible clarity, Claire understood. The whispers weren't coming from her. They were coming from the woman, the thing, in the corner of the room. It wasn't human. Before Claire could scream, the figure lunged. The figure in the corner was like a shadow made flesh, too quick, too unnatural for Claire to comprehend. As it lunged, time seemed to slow down, stretching each second into an eternity. The woman's mouth gaped wider, a terrible, yawning abyss that seemed to consume the very air around them. Thomas! Claire screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive weight of the room. Her breath came in shallow gasps, panic seizing her chest. The air felt colder now, unbearably cold, and the very walls of the room seemed to contract, pushing in on them as if they were trapped inside a living thing. Thomas shot to his feet with a burst of adrenaline, grabbing Claire's arm and pulling her toward the door. The room twisted around them, reality warping as if they were caught in a nightmare that refused to let go. But the door wouldn't open. It was stuck, frozen in place. It felt as though it was being held shut by some invisible force, some dark will that sought to keep them inside. The woman, no, the thing, was closer now, crawling with unnatural speed across the floor, her body twisting in sickening angles. Claire could hear its bones snapping and popping, each movement accompanied by a dry, wet sound, like something being dragged across gravel. Please, no, Claire whispered, her mind racing. Please, no. Thomas, breathing heavily, backed away from the door, his eyes wide with terror. It's not real. It's not real. But Claire could feel it, the undeniable weight of it. It was real, and it was getting closer. With one final, desperate effort, Thomas yanked at the door handle again, and this time, it gave way with a sickening creak. They stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. The hallway stretched out before them, long and dark, the walls seemingly closing in with each passing second. Claire didn't know where they were running, only that they needed to get away from that thing. It was behind them, following them with its twisted, jerking movements, its inhuman whispers echoing through the empty halls. She glanced back, but the hallway was empty. There was no sign of it. But she could feel it. Something in the air, a cold presence lurking just beyond her sight. Thomas grabbed her wrist and pulled her forward, his eyes wild with fear. "We need to get out of here," he gasped. Now. They reached the stairs and ran down, the old wood creaking under their feet. They passed rooms, empty, lifeless rooms, but the whispers were growing louder, more frantic. As they reached the ground floor, the feeling of being pursued became overwhelming. The air felt thick, like they were wading through a fog of suffocating dread. At the bottom of the stairs, they skidded to a halt. The front door of the inn stood ajar, an eerie light spilling in from the outside. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The world beyond was dark and silent, the oppressive weight of the inn pressing down on them from all sides. But then she heard it again, a soft whisper, barely audible over the sound of her own racing heartbeat. "Help me." It was coming from the open door. The air around it shimmered, as though reality itself was rippling. "No," Thomas whispered, shaking his head. "Not again." But Claire couldn't stop herself. She moved toward the door, her body acting on its own, driven by an overwhelming compulsion. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered just above the doorframe. And then she saw it, a figure, standing in the doorway. The woman, or the thing that had been in the room, was standing outside. Her form flickered in and out of existence, as though she were being pulled between two worlds. The black voids of her eyes met Claire's, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. And then the figure spoke. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice like a hiss in the wind, cold and sharp. Claire felt herself step forward, her mind screaming for her to stop, but her body betrayed her. She couldn't look away from the figure's eyes, the emptiness within them drawing her in like a black hole. Thomas grabbed her arm, pulling her back just as she reached the threshold. "No," he yelled. "Claire, don't." But it was too late. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, and with a sickening lurch, they were no longer standing at the door. They were somewhere else. The world had changed. The dark woods that surrounded the inn were gone. The earth beneath their feet was soft, like dirt, but it was cold, unnaturally cold. Claire stumbled, disoriented, her mind struggling to grasp what had happened. The landscape around them was wrong. The trees were twisted, their bark blackened as though burned by some unseen fire. The sky above them was a sickly shade of purple, swirling with clouds that seemed to move in unnatural patterns. And there, standing in front of them, was the woman, or the thing, again. But this time, she wasn't alone. There were others. Figures stood in the distance, half visible in the gloom, their forms flickering like shadows, moving in jerky, unnatural ways. They were tall, thin, their limbs elongated and twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Their eyes were like empty pits, their faces blank slates. Claire's stomach churned, her body racked with the urge to flee, but there was nowhere to run. She turned to Thomas, her voice breaking. "What is this place? Where are we?" Thomas didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the woman in front of them, his face pale and contorted in terror. We've crossed over," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "This is the place between." The woman stepped closer, her movements jerky, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. Her mouth opened wide, and from it came a voice, no longer a whisper, but a low, guttural growl. "Welcome," she hissed. "Welcome to the Hollow." And that's when Claire realized, she wasn't just in a dream, or some twisted vision. She was somewhere else, somewhere between worlds. This was a place where time didn't exist. A place where the dead and the living were trapped in an endless, tormenting cycle. The figures behind the woman began to move forward, their limbs stretched and twisted like vines. Claire screamed as they closed in on her, the whispers growing louder, drowning out everything else. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the face of the woman. The thing, smiling at her, a smile that was too wide, too sharp, filled with malice and hunger. When Claire regained consciousness, she found herself lying on cold, uneven ground. The earth beneath her was soft, damp, and pulsed with an eerie rhythm, like the beating of a heart. The air was thick with a putrid smell, rotting leaves, decaying flesh, and something else, something metallic like blood. Her eyes fluttered open, but all she could see were the dark shapes of twisted trees reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Her body felt heavy, as though the weight of the world had settled on her chest. She pushed herself up, her head pounding with a dull, relentless throb. Her limbs were stiff, her fingers numb as though she had been asleep for far too long. As she stood, the ground beneath her shifted again, sinking with each step, as though she were walking on the skin of some ancient, slumbering beast. "Thomas," she called, her voice weak, trembling. The sound was swallowed by the oppressive stillness of the place, leaving her with nothing but the echo of her own fear. A rustling noise caught her attention. It was faint but unmistakable. She turned her head sharply, her heart skipping a beat. Through the darkness, Thomas appeared, stumbling toward her, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. His eyes were wide, darting around as though he were afraid to look too long at anything in this place. He grabbed her arm when he reached her, his grip tight with desperation. "Claire, we have to get out of here," he said, his voice hoarse, panicked. "This place, it's not real. None of this is real." Claire tried to steady herself, but the ground beneath them was shifting again. The trees around them groaned and creaked, as if the entire forest was waking up, stretching its limbs. She could feel it now, a deep, resonating hum in the air, a presence that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. "Where are we?" she whispered, unable to tear her eyes away from the horizon, which seemed to stretch endlessly, an infinite expanse of twisted trees and shadows. Thomas opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, the ground trembled beneath them, and a low, rumbling growl filled the air. The earth cracked open, splitting wide, and from the gaping chasm emerged figures, more of them. Twisted, misshapen things, their bodies thin and elongated, with dark, hollow eyes and skin stretched too tightly over bones. They moved slowly at first, their jerky, unnatural movements growing faster, more determined as they emerged from the darkness. Claire felt a wave of terror wash over her, her knees weakening, but Thomas yanked her away, dragging her toward what seemed like a distant path, a narrow trail between the gnarled trees. She stumbled behind him, the whispers of the creatures growing louder, surrounding them with an eerie cacophony. "There's no escape," Thomas muttered, his voice breaking as he pushed forward. "They'll follow us forever. This place, this hollow, it never lets anyone go." Suddenly, Claire stopped. Her breath caught in her throat, and a shiver ran down her spine. There, ahead of them, standing in the center of the path, was the woman. The thing. She was motionless, her long, dark hair hanging like a veil around her face. Her empty, void-like eyes stared into Claire's soul, as if she could see into every corner of her being. The woman raised a hand slowly, and the ground beneath Claire's feet rumbled again. The trees groaned louder, their branches twisting and thrashing like the tendrils of some monstrous beast. The whispers became deafening. "You can't leave," the woman hissed, her voice low, dripping with malice. "You never leave the hollow. It claims you, and you remain here, forever." Claire felt her legs tremble, and her heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at Thomas, but he was staring at the woman, his expression one of complete horror. "No," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "No, no, no, this isn't real." But Claire knew better. This place, whatever it was real. The hollow was alive, and it was hungry. With a screech that reverberated through the trees, the woman stepped forward. Her form seemed to twist, growing larger, her limbs elongating, stretching like a monstrous shadow. She was not just a person anymore, not even a creature. She was something far worse, a malevolent force that defied nature. And then, with a flick of her wrist, the world around them changed again. Claire and Thomas were no longer standing on the path. The air was now thick with fog, and the ground beneath them was no longer soft earth but a hard, slick stone that gleamed in the dim light. They found themselves in the center of a labyrinth, an endless maze of twisting corridors, each one darker than the last, the walls slick and cold to the touch. The distant sound of dripping water echoed through the maze, adding to the disorienting, suffocating atmosphere. Thomas let out a shaky breath. "Where are we? What is this place?" Claire looked around, her mind racing. "It's a maze," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A labyrinth. But I don't understand, it's like the hollow, it's changing. We're not in the same place anymore." Thomas swallowed hard, his face pale. "We need to find an exit. We need to get out. This place, it's alive." It's alive. The walls of the labyrinth seemed to pulse, each beat of the unseen heart sending tremors through the stone. Shadows darted at the edges of their vision, flickering and vanishing the moment they tried to focus on them. Claire could feel something watching them, stalking them from the darkness, its presence thick and suffocating. And then the whispers started again. "Help me." The voice was familiar, haunting. Claire's blood ran cold as the sound of the voice filled the narrow corridors, echoing off the walls. It was the same voice she had heard before, the one that had called out to her from the room in the inn. It was desperate, pleading, but there was something else beneath it, something darker, more sinister. Without thinking, Claire started walking toward the sound, her feet moving as though controlled by an unseen force. Thomas tried to stop her, grabbing her arm, but she pulled away, her mind consumed by the voice, the need to follow it, to understand it. "Claire, stop," Thomas cried, his voice shaking with panic. But it was too late. The walls of the labyrinth began to shift around them, narrowing, twisting. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, and Claire felt her body trembling, her legs giving way beneath her. She fell to her knees, gasping for breath, her hands clutching at the slick stone beneath her. And then, before her, she saw it. A figure, small, frail, a child, emerged from the shadows. The child was gaunt, pale, with eyes that were nothing but empty voids. It stepped forward, its limbs jerking as though it were controlled by some unseen hand. "Help me," the child whispered, its voice broken and hollow. Claire froze. She knew this child. She had seen it before, in the inn. The child reached out toward her, its fingers long and twisted, its nails like claws. As it touched her hand, Claire felt a surge of cold rush through her, a flood of darkness that seemed to rip through her very soul. And then everything went black. When Claire regained consciousness, it was not the same labyrinth that surrounded her. The air was no longer thick with fog, nor was the ground slick and cold. Instead, she found herself back in the inn, lying on the floor of the hallway, disoriented and gasping for breath. She sat up, her head spinning, her skin clammy with cold sweat. Everything was still, too still. The silence in the air was oppressive, pressing down on her chest with an almost physical weight. Claire rubbed her eyes, hoping the image before her would change, but when she opened them again, the familiar, crumbling walls of the inn were still there. The dim light from the flickering overhead bulb cast long shadows across the floor, and the distant creaks of the building settling added to the oppressive atmosphere. But something was off. Claire stood shakily, her legs unsteady beneath her. She glanced around the hallway. It was just like before, but this time, it felt wrong. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive, as if they were waiting to consume her. The air was thicker, colder. She heard a door creak open behind her. Her heart raced. "Thomas." She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The door at the end of the hallway was ajar, a faint light spilling out from the crack. Without thinking, Claire started toward it, her footsteps heavy on the old wooden floor, each one echoing in the dead silence. The door led to the room that had once been locked, the room that had been so much more than it appeared. As she stepped inside, the air grew colder, and a low, guttural whisper brushed her ear. "You're too late." Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. The whisper came from the corner of the room, just beyond her sight. The shadows there were moving, writhing as though something were trapped inside them. She reached for the light switch, but before she could touch it, something brushed against her shoulder. A cold, clammy sensation like ice against her skin. She spun around, but there was nothing there. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, the woman, no, the thing, was standing again. Her eyes were hollow, vast pits of darkness, and her mouth was stretched wide in an unnatural grin, exposing too many teeth. Her body was contorted, the bones visible beneath her skin, which stretched tight over them like taut fabric. Claire took a step back, her body trembling with fear, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. "You thought you could escape," the woman hissed, her voice a low, resonating growl. "But you cannot escape me. You never will." Claire's heart pounded in her chest, each beat deafening in the heavy silence. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as the thing's hollow eyes locked onto hers. The walls of the room began to close in on her, the air thickening, suffocating. "No," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. I can't." The The woman's smile widened, stretching impossibly wide until her face was nothing but a grotesque mask of hunger and malice. "You are mine," she hissed. "All of you. All of this." And then, with a swift, jerking motion, the thing lunged. Claire's mind snapped. Panic surged through her as her body jerked backward, her feet scrambling for purchase on the slick floor. The air around her seemed to crackle with energy, as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to flee, but the room, the inn, seemed to warp, shifting around her like it was alive. The walls stretched and contracted, the door growing farther and farther away with each step she took. The thing, no longer a woman, but something far worse, was right behind her, its breath a hot, rancid wind on her neck. Claire stumbled, crashing into a piece of furniture, but the impact didn't register. It was as if her body was no longer her own. The fear and panic overwhelmed her, pushing her forward through the endless, twisting hallways, but no matter how fast she ran, no matter how far she went, the thing was always there, just behind her, its presence suffocating. The floor beneath her feet seemed to give way, crumbling into a black abyss. She fell, screaming, but the sound of her own voice was swallowed by the darkness. Her hands reached out, desperate to grab something, anything, to stop her descent, but there was nothing. Just empty space, and the cold, bitter laughter of the thing echoing in her ears. Suddenly, she stopped falling. She was in a new place now. The walls around her were broken, twisted, cracked beyond recognition. The floor was covered in a thick, black sludge that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The air was thick with an unnatural fog that clung to her skin, making it hard to breathe. And there, in the center of the room, was Thomas. He was standing, motionless, his eyes wide, his face pale and vacant. His body was stiff, rigid, as though he were made of stone. He didn't move when she called his name. "Thomas!" Claire cried, rushing toward him. But as she got closer, she saw it, the change. His skin was gray, lifeless, his features twisted in a grotesque mockery of his former self. The air around him crackled with dark energy, and his eyes, once full of life, were now empty, hollow voids. Claire reached out, but her hand stopped just before it touched his skin, as if an invisible barrier were holding her back. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking. A low, rumbling growl filled the room, and the air seemed to vibrate with a terrible energy. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, and the thing, the force, emerged from the darkness, its eyes glowing like burning embers. It reached out a skeletal hand toward Thomas, and Claire screamed, but it was too late. The thing's hand passed through Thomas's body, and with a sickening lurch, his form dissolved into the shadows, vanishing as though he had never existed. "No!" Claire cried, stumbling forward, but the room began to crumble around her. The walls fractured, the floor split apart, and the very fabric of reality began to unravel. And then, in the final moments, she understood. The hollow had claimed them both. The world dissolved around her, the last remnants of the inn vanishing like smoke in the wind. Claire was falling again, but this time there was no end. No escape, no hope. She was trapped in the darkness, consumed by it. And the whispers began again. Low, eerie, persistent. "You are mine." Her vision blurred, the edges of her consciousness slipping away, until all that remained was the cold, suffocating void.